Welcome to Thinking Deeply About Primary Education, the podcast that makes time and space to think about pedagogy, teaching and learning, professional development, anything of interest to time poor but enthusiasm rich primary teachers. This week, we've got another inspirational episode featuring James Pembroke and Richard Selfridge, and we're going to dive into the world of assessment, and who better to talk to than two of the greatest minds in this field. I know you're going to absolutely love this episode, and I can't wait to share it with you. Don't forget, you can follow TDaPE on YouTube, on Discord, and on Ko-fi for extra bits and pieces here and there. But without further ado, let's spend some time thinking deeply about primary education. So this week, I'm delighted to be joined by James Pembroke, Richard Selfridge. It's great to have you here, James and Richard. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
Absolutely, same here. Looking forward to it.
No, it's an absolute pleasure. And we always begin with our guests and numbers to get a feel for who they are. I think if we start with you, Richard, and then we'll move over to you, James. My first question, Richard, is years as a teacher?
That's a good question. I remember when I used to say to people, yeah, I've been a teacher for a few years, 10 years, 11 years. But now I'm looking at it and I'm going, yeah, I'm up to 19 now. So I think next year is my 20th year in teaching.
Nice. I was talking to Becky Alms. I think she's been in education 20 years, and we're talking about whether you get a watch or a clock once you hit that milestone.
At the very least.
I think you used to. First year group taught?
So when I trained as an early years teacher, early years in primary. So I was thinking about this, that so the first year group that I taught was nursery. I was teaching 3 and 4 year olds. But my first official post was the standard. Let's put them into that year group so they don't mess it up. So I taught year 3 for a year, 2 years, I think, my first 2 years. So I started with the lovely year 3s and enjoyed it tremendously.
Last year group taught?
I've been doing lots of work on COVID recovery this year. So I've been teaching across Key Stage 2, teaching year 3, 4, 5, 6. But I did do a couple of days with the year 2 group recently. And again, as much as I've ended up teaching upper Key Stage 2 mainly, my last year group was year 2. And if anybody wants to get me to do more work in year 2, I love working with year 1, year 2. So they're great.
Most important year group?
It's such a difficult thing, isn't it? I still think that the early years are hugely important, and settling children into school, particularly because one of my views about primary education is that as much as it's reading and writing and adding up, it's all about the socialization into school and getting children to appreciate what school is. So I think there's lots of different points when it's hugely important. But no, I think that kind of reception year 1 is such a crucial point, and you see things that roll down through the years. If you teach those children and see them when they get a bit older, you can kind of see little patterns that you've picked up early on, so you can deal with those early on. So always reception year 1, I think.
Favorite year group?
You've probably got a bit of a gather here. Actually, to be fair, I've taught from reception up to year 6. And each of them have got their own charms. I mean, I love working with year 6s when they get to that point. And you can, I say this to people often, that the key stages, they make a lot of sense. There's a big change between a child going from Key Stage 1 into Key Stage 2, Key Stage 2 into 3. And I like that change that you get in year 6s. When my thing is the Easter effect. They get to Easter and they're not little anymore. Up to year 4, 3, 4, 5, those children just need you to be there. They need an adult in place. Whereas in year 6, they get to the point where they don't actually need you in the room. And when you see that happen, you know they're ready for secondary school. And I love watching that.
Nice. I'm totally with you on that. Yeah, in terms of both the importance and the favorite year group. I think I'm a bit more comfortable with year 6, but I do really enjoy being in the early years as well. Yeah. And then the most difficult question normally, tweets.
What, in terms of whether one should tweet, or what's the question about tweets? That's a good question.
The number of tweets, it's most difficult.
Oh yeah, my number of tweets. I can't remember. I think I'm probably up at about 50 to 100,000 at this point. I don't know. You're at the point where I'm probably the same as a lot of people with Twitter. My Twitter use has changed hugely. It was, I used it a great deal, and I use it a great deal at various points. Today, for example, I've found it really useful because there's been a bunch of stuff that's been published. But yeah, I'm comfortably now at the point where I tweet regularly enough, but equally, as with all of us, I think with Twitter, we have this sort of interesting love-hate relationship with it. So.
Absolutely. And James, if I can move over to you, years in education.
Right. So my history is sort of a bit more different, really. So I come at it from a sort of data background. So I've worked previous to what I'm currently doing. I currently work for a company called Insight, tracking system company. I know we're going to talk about tracking systems. I've worked for them since 2018. Prior to that, I was a sort of self-employed consultant for a few years. Prior to that, I worked as a data analyst in a Gloucestershire County Council school improvement team. And prior to that, I worked as a data analyst for the Learning and Skills Council, which was a now defunct government funding quango, focusing on like post-16 skills and FE. So that's kind of my education side of things. It's very much like looking at education data. So that's probably, I don't know, like 15, 16 years of working with education data. And before that, I was doing various sort of database jobs for companies. One was a publishing company and another was an oil services company. And and before that, I did a PhD in geology, in granite specifically, which is a bit bizarre looking back at that now. So there you go.
Fascinating. Books published?
Right. So you may or may not know, but Rich and I wrote a book, Data Proof Your School, which came out this year. So we wrote that together that was our lockdown project. So that's obviously a must read, and hopefully we will talk about that in a bit. I also have contributed. What did I contributed to Ray Snape's the Head Teacher's Handbook, so I've contributed to that. The only other book I've written is my PhD.
Probably the most difficult book to write of all.
Yeah, but also your other lockdown project, James. You can't not remember that your book in progress, which is continuing.
Right. Well, I did. Yes, that did flash through my brain, but that's a completely separate thing. That is not data related. More a personal project on the geological evolution of the British Isles and its landscapes. So, which Richard has been joining me on some of our little treks around the country in the Lake District and in the Dales, and has I'm using him as a sounding board. So he's had to put up with detailed kind of geological descriptions of landscapes and what have you. So there you go. But that's something else.
Fantastic. I mean, certainly, during our chat episodes, we try and recommend books that around different subjects, and that sounds one that Neil Almond or someone Christopher Such might be reading and recommend to people read in the future, because it's okay knowing the curriculum, but if you've got that bank beyond where the curriculum goes, then you're a bit more informed. That sounds awesome.
I'm a bit of I love books about landscape. So I'm a real Robert Macfarlane nut. I love his books and books of that genre, which sort of beautifully and poetically describe environment and habitat and landscape. And I really love that sort of writing, that genre of writing. So I am sort of hopefully trying to do something along those lines, but really looking at the evolution of the landscape itself. So there you go.
Fantastic. Advisor on X number of government boards and groups?
Yeah, so with Richard, actually, we were on, it was ASCL's panel, wasn't it? The primary expert panel, assessment panel, where there was a report written with various recommendations on how assessment and accountability should go forward. I was also on the DFE's reception baseline stakeholder group, which was really interesting, looking at how that was developed and implemented. Sadly, obviously, over lockdown, those meetings stopped. But I went to a whole load of meetings at the DFE about that. So those probably are the two main ones. But I've been, there's loads of other organisations that I've Ofsted and Just Go, the junior school group, which I'm really interested in. So yeah, various groups, but yeah, the ASCL and the stakeholder, the reception baseline stakeholder group are two that stand out.
Blog posts?
Oh, Hundreds. I've been blogging since 2014, I think. I look back at my early blogs and they're terrible. You know, I realized that a good blog post is between sort of 400 and 800 words, you know, just not very long. You need to be able to read it in a few minutes. And my early ones were way too sort of detailed. But yeah, so I started writing in blogs in 2014 when I still worked at the local authority, which, okay, got me into some trouble. So yeah, tweeting and blogging don't go sort of neatly with work in local government, you know, working for a local authority. So I think it was at that point where I realized that, yeah, it's probably now it's time to move on. You know, I've got opinions. This doesn't sit well with my job. So, you know, I'm just going to have to take the plunge and leave and try and see if I can make this work. But the blog that really started things off for me, I think, was I wrote one in, I think it was in 2015, The Progress Myth, which was after the assessment without levels thing had been announced, the removal of levels had been announced. I think I wrote it before the Commission on Assessment Without Levels report was written. And it basically just said, you can't measure progress. It's all a load of nonsense. And we should learn this, and that the whole levels thing has just been an illusion for years. So I wrote that, and that got me invited to some conferences, and that was a real boost for me, that blog post. So that was a real standout one. But I've written hundreds of blog posts. They're all on my website, sigplus.co.uk.
Yes, I was going to say, is that with their house and on whole house on Sig Plus?
Oh yeah. They're all on there.
Blog hits.
I remember when I wrote called, well, that one I just mentioned, Progress Myth, has been read stacks of times. I don't know how many, but I remember when I wrote called Arm Yourself, where I basically just went through all of these various reports that came out, like the workload, the DFE's, the Workload Commission reports on data management, the Making Data Work report by Becky Allen, the Ofsted handbook and the myth-busting statements from the Ofsted handbook, the Commission on Assessment Without Levels, various and even statements from DFE guidance, you know, so a whole bunch of different reports. And all I did was took out from that all these really key statements that even despite all these really key statements, schools were still like doing this kind of crazy stuff. And I'm saying, look, the DFE and Ofsted are saying, don't do this stuff. And I wrote this blog, which was, I don't know how long it was, but it was just literally just statement after statement. I was just copying and pasting stuff into this with a bit of text around it. And that got, in a very short space of time, that got something like 10,000 hits.
Wow, that's massive.
Which was really important. I mean, it's nice for me, but it was really important that these messages, I mean, for example, I remember one that was an Ofsted update that said Ofsted in expected progress was a DFE measure until 2015, i.e. levels of progress. So expected progress was a DFE measure until 2015. Ofsted inspectors must not use this term when referring to the progress of current pupils. They banned themselves from using the phrase expected progress. And yet every single report being delivered to governors, or every conversation taking place between head teachers and teachers and governors and all these different, and local authority advisors and all that, was all around. So what percentage of children made expected progress? What even is it? I don't know. I don't know what it is, but tell me how many children have done it. You know, you can't define it. And so that was really important. Ofsted saying, yeah, we don't even know what expected progress is, so we're not even going to talk about it. And even after they said that, still schools, and they're still doing it now. Yeah. That was a good blog post.
I mean, I started in 2008, and so I was, you know, I had been in with the tracking from the old style levels for long enough, and then this watershed moment, and then we just sort of tried to recreate what we'd done in the past in a different way. It doesn't feel like it's, you know, that might still be happening, but I'm sure we'll definitely.
It's definitely still happening, and it's quite painful. I'm sure we'll dive deeper into that in a minute.
And number of tweets.
Do you know, I don't know. How do you find out?
if you go to your profile on Twitter and you start to scroll up through your tweets, the number at the top
Oh,
appears.
look at that. 68,000 it says here. 68,000. So there we go. That's a fair amount of tweets.
I reckon
Most nonsense.
this is the 5th season, and I asked everybody how many tweets they've done, and I reckon maybe 2 or 3 came prepared with the, with the number of tweets. It's like the hidden feature on Twitter. It's not very intuitive. It just sort of appears. And why would you look through your own tweets unless you were going back to delete them and stuff? So Richard, you're a primary teacher, data consultant and author. Tell us about your journey and how you got here.
Yeah, so I started teaching 2003. I started teaching in London. I trained in London and started teaching there. And then I moved up to Yorkshire, which is where I'm now, in 2010. And sort of I had that sort of typical early years of teaching. You go into teaching assuming various things about what you're going to be there for, and then being told by schools or by the system effectively, you just kind of learn this is what actually we're doing in teaching. So I spent 5 or 6 years just, okay, so what am I doing? Learning how to teach. And then by 2012, 13, I was, almost 10 years in, and I had various opinions about what was happening in schools and so on at that time, because there was quite a lot of discussion. Again, for those people who are relatively new to education, they'll probably be surprised at there's that explosion of discussion sort of post 2010, partly because it was the new government that came in. Michael Gove came in. He was very controversial, and lots of us in schools didn't really understand what he was trying to do. Anyway, so I got very interested in looking at what was happening in education, but particularly I was interested because I went over to France for a short visit to go and look at some schools in France. And schools in France are extraordinary, or certainly were at the time. Very, in lots of ways, they're completely different from schools in England, in my experience. And I've only ever taught in England. And so I had a good look to say, well, why are things different? So I did lots of things with that. And I could bore you to death with why they're different. But after that, I then started writing some stuff because I was quite annoyed about things. So I started writing a blog anonymously. There were quite a few anonymous blogs at the time. So I wrote a blog called Icing on the Cake, which still exists and still got lots of stuff on it. Because my general view is that schools are icing on the cake. The cake is the child and the child's friends and lots of other things. And what we do is we add some icing. And I use various lines about, that icing should be glittering and should be amazing. And often it wasn't. It was just gruel, particularly when you're teaching up Key Stage 2, which I was doing at that point, and you were just basically being into this sort of meat grinder just to get results. So I wrote about a number of things because I have, various views about the way in which we educate and what we do. But I ended up doing lots of work on just saying, what on earth is Raise Online? Why are people making these assumptions about it? Partly because my background is, I did a maths and statistics degree. So people would talk about maths and statistics in a way where I was thinking, that's not how statisticians think. That's not how you should be using these numbers. So I wrote various bits, and a bit like James, where you write a post, a blog post, and people respond to it. I gave Raise Online a good kicking because it needed one. It was really distorting things. And then from then, I've just ended up doing lots and lots more work on data. Eventually, somebody asked me to write a book. So I wrote a book called Data Busting for Schools. Which is kind of where the data busting thing came from. And it was just this idea of, just use the numbers sensibly. Assessment is really useful, but just what a lot of things that were happening, particularly at that time in 2014, 15, were debatable. Which is where James and I came into each other's orbit, and then we've done lots of stuff working since then. So now I work and I do various things, working with schools, working with organizations, but I still do some teaching as well. I usually teach 2 or 3 days a week because I really enjoy teaching. I love teaching, and it's really useful to do that, just kind of keep a connection with what's actually happening in the class and in schools, as well as supporting schools on that wider stuff. And then I do lots of other stuff to do with special educational needs, and also partly because over 20 years of teaching, I've come to realize that schools are pretty good. We do a pretty good job. Children make really good development through schools. British, in particular the English system, is pretty good. But the children who you really do need support are the children who find school difficult for whatever reason, and that we should focus on those. Some of that is special educational needs, but there are other reasons why children might find school difficult. And that actually what we need to do is to work out which children need support and support them effectively. So that's kind of where I've got to.
Awesome. It's great that you've managed to keep yourself in touch with the classroom, because I think that's the most important thing, isn't it? but also you've got the chance to help people with subject that very few know much about. You're talking about statistical analysis. It's not in the head teacher wheelhouse, is it?
Well, that's my observation. Again, for those of us who work in primary education, a huge number of people haven't really studied any maths since they were, 16. It's unusual to find anybody who's done maths beyond 16 to any degree, and certainly not much statistics. So when somebody comes into you and says, "Oh, this is statistically significant," your interpretation of that is of somebody who doesn't really understand the statistics, which is fine. But I've written a couple of books and lots of blogs about how to understand and interpret the statistics. And that's one of the things which James and I do a lot of, to say to people, okay, it's fine not to really understand this stuff, but here's some information, here's some basic things you should know. And now you know that, how are you going to interpret what you've got?
Yeah, I think it's crucial, isn't it? Because, I made a decision a long time ago never to become a head teacher because of so many of the extra things that aren't teaching and learning and pedagogy and stuff like that there, the reason you become a teacher in the first place. So yes, my hat's off to anybody who successfully manages to be a head teacher, because I
think it's one of the hardest jobs in the world. I say this often, the skill set that's required to be an effective or a really good head teacher is very unusual. I've met very, very good head teachers, but it's unusual when you meet them. I've worked for a few, with a few now. But because it's such a skill set, it's such a broad skill set that you need to be able to talk to the children, to the parents, to governors, and you need to be able to do lots of things very, very well.
James, you're a data analyst, author, and currently fighting the good fight against zombie levels at Insight. Tell us about your journey and how you got here. And obviously, we've covered a bit in the numbers section.
Yeah, sure. So as I said, I way back in the dim and distant past, I studied geology, and then I moved away from that when the first job I did was more of a sort of a database job working for one of these oil services companies, and I kind of realized at that point I didn't want to work in that industry. That was not for me. So I sort of drifted into other sort of data analytical jobs, and eventually ended up in an education focused one. And this first one was, as I said, working for the Learning and Skills Council, which was dealing with post-16 funding. And at that time, every regional office, so I was in the Gloucester office, and every local office, or every month, we'll get these CDs of data would just be delivered in the post, and then they would just sit on someone's desk and no one ever did anything with them. So all this data on all the different courses that were being done, on attendance, retention, funding, all sorts of stuff. And it just sat on these CDs. And I remember there was this manager, and he had this stack of CDs on his, and every month this CD would get one CD, this stack would get one CD higher, and no one ever did anything. So I thought I will build a database. So I built this data, I put all this data into this database. And then I set about sort of building some queries, and we had SPSS, and I used SPSS to query it, which is an absolute nightmare program, and I don't ever intend to go back to it. And then I realized that we had a network, not an intranet, so I put this database onto this intranet with a sort of a nice front end, and I wrote a load of SPSS queries that could query this, so people could just literally just run this bit of code, and it would churn out the data that they wanted. And then I learned how to use crystal reports. So we could use crystal reports to interrogate and produce a nice, 1 or 2 page, nicely formatted. And I put this all out there. And then other offices started to use this database that I built. So rather than using the sort of central office's offer, which was a bit clunky and not really, they started to use mine, which was really nice. And then I went to work for a local authority, doing sort of similar stuff, really. But Richard just mentioned RAISE, and I entered the local authority when RAISE was in full swing, and RAISE at that point, a RAISE report for primary schools was over 100 pages long. So 100, we were doing primary and secondary, and 103 pages long, I think, when it was at its maximum. And I remember just the journey, the journey was going from thinking, this is obviously really important and informative stuff. And then sort of 3 years later, realizing this is all a load of garbage. And it's the same with like sort of the tracking, the internal approaches schools were taking. So the levels measures, the progress measures, thinking, I refer to this quite often, that one of my first tasks was a senior advisor came to see me and says, hey, you're the new data guy. Can you build me? And then he listed what he wanted. And he basically described a tracking system. He wanted me to build him a tracking system and in Excel. So he wanted this tracking system in Excel. And he described what happened. And he basically said, over Key Stage 2, children make 2 levels of progress, 2 whole levels of progress. And for example, a 2B, that's 15 points, and then a 4B is 27 points. And so therefore, the difference between 15 and 27 is 12. So 12 points over Key Stage 2. That's 3 points per year. That's 1 point per term. So all children need to make 1 point per term. Can you have a spreadsheet? Can you have a tracking system that counts up how many steps they've made and basically goes green or purple or red or orange or whatever, according to how many, and the expected is 3, 1 per term, 3 per year, and 4, because obviously 4 is higher than 3. 4 is more than expected. So we want everyone to make 3, and then a certain percentage to make 4. And I just remember at the time thinking, oh yeah, right. Well, of course, I didn't question it. Just think, yeah, I can build this. And I was quite excited about having a little academic project to work on, So I built this. And now I just look back at just horror. And this went out to some schools, so some schools were using this. And I just think, oh my God, it's just awful. So I went from thinking, this is all raised online. That's all really important and tells us something really important. These tracking systems and points, children make 1 point per term and 3 points per year. Obviously, that's true. To getting to this point, thinking, this is all mad. This is absolute madness. This is garbage. And it's at that point thinking, yeah, it's time to, and that's where I started to blog about things. And the first blog I wrote was on the narrowing the gap measures. So I wrote this really vitriolic, angry. Richard mentioned that like he was angry. I was also angry. And it was the gap measures. So it was so simplistic that you could easily, and everyone was expected to close the gap between the most disadvantaged and other children. And obviously we aim to do that, but the measures that were put in place, what is this? So I wrote this blog about it, a massive rant about it. And I put that out there, and I was obviously still employed at the time. And that got me in some trouble. And I went away and I went on holiday, and I came back and thought, yeah, well, whilst I was on holiday, I thought, I've got to go. I've got to leave. So I came back and I handed my notes in, and then I set out on my own, where I could write and tweet whatever I liked. So there you go. That's how I ended up here.
I mean, I'm having flashbacks as you speak. I mean, it sounds like you designed the program that I started using in 2008. I remember we had to put in every 6 weeks we'd put in this data.
Well, there are commercial systems that still exist whose roots are back then. And they started life as spreadsheets, like mine did. Mine never reached that commercial scale. It was just a handful of schools in Gloucestershire that were using it, and thankfully that died a death quite quickly. What's is it sunk cost fallacy?
Yep, the sunk cost fallacy.
That's the thing, isn't it? Where you invest a lot of time in things, and then you just don't want to let it go. You keep piling more and more into it. So I think you can be quite vain about these things, but it's important that you go, no, this is nonsense. Even though I've piled a lot of effort into this, I have to admit that this has to die. We need to bury this now. It needs to die. So yeah, let it go. Let it go. Yeah, no, I'm not going to start singing that. But yeah, I know what you mean. I know what you mean, like the flashback. So I think back and go in horror. Oh God. So I think one of the questions that we're going to talk in a bit about tracking systems, and there is a purpose to tracking systems. Don't call them tracking systems as a start, but there is a purpose to them, and they can be very useful, but we need to completely refocus them.
I see. I'm not looking forward to asking that question. I mean, 2000, whenever the conversation started to shift, 2014, that was probably around about the time that I was starting to get confident enough in my own practice, because you come in NQT 2008, you just think you're doing things wrong, so you've no idea that, because in Ireland, I don't think we had the same level of detail in our the tracking of pupils. You basically had the program of study, and you taught the program of study, and
Yeah.
it was all okay. And then I came over and thought, okay, well, this is something I need to get better at. And then I think it was Jack Marwood maybe wrote in David Dowdow's "What If Everything You Knew About Education Was Wrong," and that was the first time I'd seen someone write about assessment in a way that is.
That's my alter ego, Kieran. So I started off anonymously, as I said, writing icing on the cake as icing on the cake. And nobody knew who I was. And then somebody said, basically, who are you? We need to know who you are. So I thought, well, I'm not telling you who I am, because it was quite useful to be anonymous, a bit like James saying, because, you want to, basically, I kind of knew I had to be responsible for my opinions, but I didn't want my school to be associated with any of this at all. So I was going to be Peter Marwood, who is the I character from Withnail and I, as I'll always bore people with if you've ever watched Withnail and I. But Peter Marwood wasn't available as a Yahoo email address, so I chose Jack Marwood. So I reveal myself as Jack Marwood. So and then I kept being asked to do stuff, so I did it, and it was quite fun. I had my secret pseudonym name, so I was Jack Marwood for about 3 or 4 years. And you'll have read that in here, where I basically, again, I'm not sure that the piece which I wrote for David here, sorry David, is as good as it should have been. It was okay. David's book turned out to be a load better than I was that I anticipated, and he'd written it in a very different way. His earlier books have been kind of compilations of blogs, so I kind of compiled some blogs. But this book is really good, and again, I'm going to push it again. Excellent. So you read Jack Marwood when I was Jack Marwood.
Yes, yeah. I mean, that's got me into Edu Twitter and that sort of sphere. Because I remember seeing an advertisement or someone talking about that chapter, and then I bought David's book, and then I thought, oh my goodness, and then I read it again, and then piece by piece started getting it. You could see who to follow in the Edu Twitter sphere, who was having sort of sensible conversations and things. So that was a game changer. Neil Allman's got my book. I was actually going to check that chapter out beforehand to see if there's anything in it that was, because it's been a while since I last read it. But he had never read the book at all. I thought, Neil, you've got to read this book. All the things you've been talking about for a long time are in here. That's amazing.
Jack Marwood was a troublemaker. He was a disruptor. And I kid you not, I got warned about him. I got warned about Jack Marwood.
Associated with that Jack Marwood. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. I got warned about him. And I at that point, I'm thinking, I got to get to know this guy. Been warned about him. He must be important.
There's a great book by Becky Allen, Ben White, Matt Evans, which they wrote the next book, big thing in school improvement, which we've talked about, and they're quite good about it. They put their finger on these waves that came through education. They talk about the differentiation wave in the 2000s. Now, when I started teaching, that was a big thing. You probably got the back end of that. So when if you came up to England that time, then you've got the idea that we're going to differentiate 3 different levels and all this kind of stuff. And then the 2010s, their view is that was the data wave that came through, and that's the one which you'll have again just experienced, where you just think people will start saying things and doing things, and as we know, schools tend to flow they tend to work as a pack, so they're all kind of following each other. Nobody wants to be too out there, so they all just kind of went through, and just suddenly people would start saying things about data that, again, it sounds like you, and I suspect a lot of us were just saying that doesn't fit with what I understand about teaching, about children, about assessment even. Like Jamie was saying, I'm suddenly turning this level into a number that then I'm going to compare. So much of it, it develops a life of its own, which is why it was good that when people began to, because when Jamie and I first started saying, not sure this is sensible, people just didn't want to hear that message. They knew that there was something unusual or there's something odd, but they said, but we have to do what we're doing, particularly because Ofsted were doing what they were doing at the time. Anyway, so things changed a lot at that time, certainly in the mid 2010s.
Yeah, I mean, we don't like change in schools. I mean, there's definitely a reluctance to move away from levels, but I think I might allude to that in one of the questions. In 2014, national curriculum levels were removed, and I think we were given 2 years' notice as well, weren't we? And I think it was an attempt to nudge schools towards more efficient practices. I think you talk about Michael Gove. I think his plan was to remove lots of stuff and see what the chaos creates. I'm not saying either for or against that, but that seemed to be where he was going. And then I think Daisy Christodoulou wrote Making Good Progress around about 2015-16 about what those practices might look like. But in 2022, it doesn't feel like the nudge has taken us far enough. Why do you think ineffective practices are so ingrained in our schools and how they operate?
I'll start with that one just to say, again, I think you're right that schools don't particularly like change, because schools are not ultimately in charge of their own destiny, because somebody's going to come in and check what they're doing. And so Ofsted does have a big impact. So Ofsted have an impact there, and we can't get away from that. The DFE also has an impact as well. So there's a bit of that going where schools worry about things. And again, That has been an issue. The DfE, to be fair to them, have done quite a bit of work on their workload reports, which they did again in the mid 2010s, where they began to say, actually, we're clearly affecting what's happening in schools. And a lot of that information that the DfE got, they got through bloggers like Jamie and I and others saying these things. I think one of the issues then is that education has just not been a political issue for the last 5 years, really. I mean, there's been certain aspects of education trying to assess during the pandemic being one of them. But at GCSE, at A level, at primary, it hasn't been that much of a big issue. So there's been less of a move centrally, I think, to try and affect schools. So schools have largely been left to themselves. They're trying to figure out ways to move forward. But then they've also had, they've been overtaken by the next wave in education, which is the curriculum wave, which is going through at the moment, where everybody's worrying about curriculum. So they're a lot of schools are sort of doing things in assessment that they think they should be doing, but they're not quite sure. So therefore, things haven't changed that quickly. That said, a number of things have changed. Levels have moved on, but we still have tracking systems that basically have recreated levels and the way which levels worked. Schools are using standardized assessments more, but maybe not as much as they might do. So there's a bit of limbo, which again, that's the reason why Jamie and I sat down and said, actually, so I'd written data busting for schools, which gave RAISE and statistical significance as used in RAISE a good kicking. We kind of said, actually, what schools, they just want to know what they should do, which is why we wrote Data Proof Your School, to say, these are the issues you need to have a look at. This is the issue with teacher assessment. These are the things which you need to know about, various other things. This is what you need to do to move forward. So I think schools are still in that position where they're not quite sure what to do. And other things are taking precedence. So they're still kind of doing things that they were doing because that's what we were doing before. That's my take at the moment. Jamie, what's yours?
Well, I think it's a combination of inertia and fear. I think that there's a reluctance to change until you reach that point, that kind of tipping point where everyone changes, or enough have done it. So I think we are kind of getting there now. But what I really worry about, that we talk about this in the book, there are various pressures. There are external pressures. There are perceived external pressures. There's still this belief that, well, Ofsted are going to, I still hear head teachers go, well, okay, when I have meetings with head teachers and they start talking about their data and preparing for Ofsted, and they said, but Ofsted aren't going to look at your internal data. They're not going to look at it. I've not spoken to a single head teacher of a school that has been inspected that said, oh yeah, they looked at our data. They've said it. It's there. I mean, it's like that blog post that I said I wrote, Arm Yourself. If you know all this stuff and you go, why are you asking me for this? When it actually says in your guidance that you will not ask for this. And you go, oh, okay, your own guidance. So they're not asking for this data. But I think there's, in some cases, schools go, oh yeah, they say that. But, so there's a bit of suspicion and disbelief, cynicism around that. But there's a lot of fear. There's a fear. And sadly, data, the focus of data in schools is still very much in many cases, on accountability. It's a tool for accountability rather than a tool for teaching and learning. But it should be the latter, and then the former takes care of itself. What you don't want is data that becomes distorted to give a nice view of your school. But I think that's the risk, because that's the focus. It needs to prove something to my governors. It needs to prove something to my LA advisor. It needs to prove something to the Ofsted inspector or to the MAT CEO or whoever it is. It needs to prove something to them. And then everything just gets distorted out of shape. So there's no point collecting it in the first place. There's a lot of fear. And particularly those schools that are in vulnerable situations. The craziest conversations I have are with those head teachers that say, yeah, I know that what I'm doing is nonsense. I know it's garbage, but I have to do it because you're essentially saying that you can't start to do things right until you are no longer RI in your good. So only good schools. I remember a head teacher saying this to me once. So she was told by their advisor, their LA advisor said, I'm quoting, don't start getting any highfalutin ideas about assessment. Only good schools can do what they like. So you are not a good school. You're an RI school. So you're going to have to do what I'm telling you. And that's basically track everything that moves, record data every few weeks, make sure the numbers always go up, make sure they make X whatever points per year or whatever it is. This is what you're going to have to do. And you go, yeah, I know it's garbage, but this is what I have to do. And when we're a good school, then we can start to get things right. You go, what?
One of the other issues is that, for a lot of school leaders, you've been in education for some time. So you've probably been in education for, 10 years or so, 10 years plus, let's say, if you're going to be a head teacher, one would hope, some head teachers obviously make it earlier than that, but you've got to be in education for a while. And therefore, you're quite used to these practices that were very embedded in the 2000s, in the early 2010s. And it's hard to let go of those things, unless you're one of those head teachers who has been able to, really think about things that and you've been able to just have the courage to say, I am going to do what I believe to be right, rather than what I believe, I'm just going to do what I've always done. So I think there's a bit of that as well. So therefore, I do think that there's a lot of potential in this next 10 years, because as head teachers, new set of head teachers come through, older head teachers are just more, just get moving with the way things have changed. So I think we'll see how that changes. But there's quite a bit of inertia there in schools. Again, you also tend to find that for a lot of teachers who've been around for a long while, Jamie and I do a lot of training with teachers in schools and organizations. And, you ask people, how much training have you had on assessing pupils? And if you came into the profession, 5+ years ago, the answer is not a lot. There wasn't a great deal. Recent trainees have had more, and it's one of the things that the Carter review of initial teacher training picked up on. It's just that there's so many things you need to learn when you're learning to teach, that assessment hasn't been seen as particularly high. So a lot of people come in not really knowing how to assess. So again, there's a lot of work to be done there, just to help people understand the basics of assessment, what the benefits of it, but also the potential drawbacks, and how you should move sensibly forward.
So we talk a lot about standardized tests in our events, our training sessions, talk a lot about, and we did in the book as well. The standardized tests are great, they have a purpose, but I think that schools possibly expect too much of them, maybe overly reliant on them, think that it's telling them something that it isn't, and that's a risk. So this is about understanding the purpose of the assessment, what it can and can't do, but there's maybe been a knee-jerk reaction. And I think that's accelerated in the last couple of years with the COVID lockdowns. We need something that's more reliable. We need a standardized test. What's everyone else doing? Oh, they're doing this series test. Let's just get those then. We'll just get those in and we'll use those. And there's even a lack of understanding on what a standardized score is. We talk a lot about the difference in standardized scores and these Key Stage 2 scaled scores, that there are similarities in the numbers, but they actually are fundamentally different. So understanding those assessments is vital, and that's still an area of concern.
Yeah, I think it does take a lot of bravery, particularly when you're in a sort of struggling school, or a so-called struggling school, to put your neck against or run against the tide, sort of. Yeah, I mean, I have something similar whenever I talk to teachers about textbooks, and head teachers will have come up, differentiating 3 to 6 different ways. It worked for them. So, why should everyone be doing the same thing at the same time? So whenever you were mentioning there, Richard, I can see a lot of parallels with the conversations I'm trying to have with head teachers as well. So yeah, it makes a whole lot of sense. Yeah, but I think the most recent Ofsted framework, like you see, go back to the very start of the response, hasn't really had a chance to have a full cycle.
Sure.
Because it was 2018, 2019-ish. And then very soon in that year, the schools were partially closed. And then it's been pretty disrupted since then. Schools have been inspected, but so fingers crossed they're true to their word. In the inspections I've seen, they have been, like you said, no one's been asked for data. And I think once other head teachers see that happening, they're all okay. So that's a real thing. So yeah, fingers crossed.
They became a risk to the integrity of assessment data, and they recognized that. They realized that the systems, the data that they were being confronted with when they went to schools, one, were overly complicated, two, were generally meaningless, and were being and the data was being produced pretty much solely just to keep them happy, or keep various external audiences happy, and advisors and governors, and that it wasn't really about what it should be about. And so by removing themselves from that, seemed like a bit of a nuclear option. And some people, I can understand this, some people are a bit annoyed about it, because if you've invested quite heavily in standardized tests, that should prove something. But then there's always that risk that children spend too much time doing tests, that you spend too much time preparing those children, not just for Key Stage 2 SATs, but for their autumn NFER test, or whatever. That's mad. So accountability relies on accurate data, but accountability distorts the very data that it relies on. So there can be a bit of a catch-22 there, and we need to reduce the risk of distortion as much as we possibly can. Otherwise, there's no point in collecting data.
That's beautiful. I think that if people only hear one 30-second clip, it has to be that bit there, doesn't it? I think.
Like the soundbite.
Feeds really went into my next question, because I think, an over-reliance or over-eagerness to utilize teacher assessment appears one of the most prevalent practices. And I think, in my opinion, it's probably best avoided. How would you or do you approach teacher assessment? And does it have any saving graces that I might be overlooking? So I'm willing to accept that I might not have the whole picture.
I'm going to jump in because, again, so as a teacher, again, it's my strong view. Again, my trip to France was so useful because it sent me off on lots of different things. But I was fascinated in 2012 looking at a primary classroom in France where there was almost no assessment happening at all. This is the curriculum. We're going to teach you the curriculum. I've taught you the lesson. And if you haven't learnt it, well, that's your fault or your problem. It's not mine. I'm not assessing you. Whereas in the English system, and it's probably worth speaking about the English system, you can't teach in England without assessment. I say this often. You can't teach without assessment. You have to be spending your time thinking, which of these pupils do I think understand this? Where are my pupils? You're spending that all the time you're assessing. But the issue then is how much of that assessment that you're doing is actually going to be recorded anywhere. And I talk about this. You've got to think about it. So you're gathering information, you're collating it, you're analyzing it, and then you're hopefully doing something with it. A load of information is being gathered by teachers, but it isn't being collated. It shouldn't need to be collated. As a teacher, particularly as a primary school teacher, you've got your class 20 to 30 children, and you need to know those pupils, so you need to get them. So therefore, teacher assessment is vital. But as we know from the work that Daisy Christodoulou's done and others, you're probably wrong. You don't know where you're wrong, but you're probably wrong. So what you need is some independent way of checking to say, well, how do I see? So because, again, the assumption, as we often say, if pupils are attentive and quiet and focused and always putting their hands up, you tend to assume that they're learning stuff and they know more than they actually do. And pupils who are annoying and loud and distracted, you assume have learned less. Whereas, so standardized assessments of some kind of a standardized assessment that allows you to take your biases or minimize your biases as much as possible are really useful. But I don't think that it's possible to teach in England without some kind of assessment. The question then is, because when we talk about these things, again, the language is important, because teacher assessment is fine. Teacher assessment that requires you to collate that information in some way that then becomes a teacher assessment system, that's the problem that we're talking about here. So again, so what you're looking to do is to try and minimize that assessment. And the thing which Jamie and I have come to the view of is, as a teacher, you need to know which of these pupils are fine, are just getting on with things. Do we think we teach them, we give them the opportunities to learn, and as far as we can see, they're learning the things which we want them to learn. And which pupils are not fine, which people struggle, find this difficult, aren't concentrating, or whatever. And that's your real filter that you need a sense of which pupils are not doing okay, or just not fine, and who's fine. And if your teacher assessment works that way, so you as a teacher know, okay, of these children, these ones I think are okay at the moment, and these ones maybe less so. And I think if you can capture that information simply, and a simple binary fine, not fine is okay, but you can differentiate that a little bit more because we know a little bit more about the pupils who do struggle. And then the other thing which we talk about is then using that over time. So you're not looking at, you need to get away from the whole snapshot idea of data. That data is the last time I had a quick look at them, this is what I saw. And as I've said, and I'll say many times, the most frustrating thing working in English schools is when you inherit a new class and you're told, here's the data for your class, and that data is the last assessment that was done. And as that makes no sense. In year 4 or 5, that makes no sense. You should have 5 years worth of data by this point. Even in year 2, you should have 2 and a bit years of data. The whole idea that you in year 2 should be told this is what they got the last assessment is crazy. So teacher assessment is really useful as a broad, rough filters to where you think you are. And it makes even more sense if you can capture it quickly and easily, and build picture over time. So that's broadly where as in these are things which Jamie and I've talked about at length, that teacher assessment is useful that way, I think.
My focus on this is very much on the statutory assessment side of things. I've done a talk recently on this. I did one at Research Ed, and I also include it in our Data Busters days as well. That if you look at secondary schools, there are 2 statutory assessments. Well, there's GCSEs and there's A levels. GCSEs obviously statutory assessment, but there's nothing in between Key Stage 2 and GCSE. Then you look at primary schools, and we have the reception baseline, the foundation stage profile, phonics in year 1, potentially phonics again in year 2, Key Stage 1 assessments in year 2, which involve both a test and a teacher assessment in reading, writing, maths, and science. Now we have a multiplication check in year 4, and then we have a suite of tests, obviously, at the end of year 6, and a teacher assessment in writing and science. So there's a vast amount of assessment going on, and it is heavily reliant on teacher assessment. And you don't have to look that far to find evidence that assessment is dubious. If you look at, we all love the phonics the distribution of phonics scores. We all love that cliff edge, that bonkers graph, right? Which is like no one gets 0 to 30, relatively speaking. You know, the axis is what, you know, thousands of children getting each of the marks. And then there's that little dip, isn't there? Hardly anyone gets between 0 and 30, and even fewer get like 31. Like, no, who get 31? It's nuts. Like, it's a dip at 31, and then boom. It's like a takeoff, you know, it's just like a rocket going off at 32. Now, foundation stage profile has changed a bit or it changed significantly actually, because, I used the word significant. Oh, sorry.
If it's every word significant,
yes word.
But it isn't statistical significant.
Yeah. So we used to assess children as emerging, expected, or exceeding in those 17 goals. And then there was a graph buried in the annual report, which shows the total point scores distribution for the foundation stage profile. And if you got the lowest score, you can get 17 times 1, 17 times emerging. The highest score you can get is 51, 17 times exceedings, 3. But everyone just gets, it's Goldilocks, isn't it? It's just right. Everyone gets, is expected. So you end up like this bar graph that shows like no one getting any of this, and there's this huge great spike at 34, and then like no one at the other end. So there is weird things like that. We know that there's a big discrepancy between Key Stage 1 outcomes in all through primary schools and infant schools. The finger of blame is often pointed at infant schools for overinflating their Key Stage 1 results, but that's not necessarily fair. It may be fair in some cases, but not across the board. We know that there is a problem with all through primary schools who look at their Key Stage 1 result and their Key Stage 1 and think, is this a result or is this a baseline for our progress? And overwhelmingly, it's a baseline for progress, because the progress scores at Key Stage 2 are more critical than the attainment results at Key Stage 1. So you are more likely to think, let's not have too many children achieving greater depth. We're not allowed. It's like level 3. I remember head teachers that were quite brazen about this in network meetings, local authority meetings, who go, we don't do level 3 at Key Stage 1 anymore. We don't do it. 2A is our maximum. Why would we give level 3? No one's going to get 3 levels of progress, so we're not doing it. Right. So they would be quite open about it. And we still have that problem now. So we know there are problems with foundation stage. It didn't used to be the case, but what started to happen was people started to, I say people, I mean Ofsted, I mean the DFE, I mean LA advisors, I mean, there are others, no doubt, would start to look at the results at foundation stage and the results at Key Stage 1 and start to try and make links. So they would say, well, what percentage of children that exceeded the early learning goal in reading went on to achieve greater depth in reading at Key Stage 1? You go, what are you doing? What are you doing? So then suddenly you see a dip in the percentage of children exceeding the early learning goals. In the next year, you see the data start to bend, and it bends beyond its elastic limit, and then it snaps. And that's what happens. It snaps. I think phonics is highly dubious. the foundation stage profile results are highly dubious. Key stage 1 results in many schools are highly dubious. I don't know what will happen with multiplication check. It's much more difficult because that's an online, I suppose it's difficult and they've got 6 seconds to get the result in, but not so easy to manipulate, obviously. And then there are cases of maladministration at key stage 2 every year. Schools are found out for that. And can you be surprised? And we know, by the way, on the subject of teacher assessment, writing at key stage 2 was until this year the highest of all the subjects. So, okay, let's put except science. What is going on with that? So the difference between the science sampling tests and the percentage achieving expected standards, it's like hardly any. It was a very small percentage. It's less than half, I think. I don't know what the latest results are, but it's a smaller proportion. And then it's like 80% of children achieve it based on the teacher assessment. But in terms of writing, there was a big difference between the percentage of children achieving the expected standard in writing and the percentage achieving the expected standard in reading, which is based on a test. And for years, this was going on. And we all knew this was like really iffy, but it just carried on year after year. The writing was the highest of the subjects. And FFT Data Lab did a really good paper on that when the results first came out in 2016. They looked at they plotted at local authority level the percentage of children achieving expected standards in writing against those achieving expected standards in reading, and they identified some local authorities that had much higher writing results compared to reading and probably had quite lenient moderation regimes, and those that were the opposite, that probably had really harsh regimes. And the craziest thing is, if you're in a MAT, you can choose with which local authority you have your moderation arrangement. So you can just go, well, we had a bad experience there, let's go to this LA instead, and we'll be moderated by them in future. So there are massive problems with using teacher assessment for accountability, which I've already talked about before, whether that's at the classroom level and using a teacher's assessment to monitor their own performance, which really, come on, that's madness. I sometimes joke about this. It's like the data you put into the tracking system will affect your pay rise. You go, what? So the more I press this button, the more my money goes up. I mean, I know it's not quite as simple as that, but it sort of feels like that. Why would you do that? Why would you put that regime in place? You're just asking for trouble. But it's the same at national level by saying, oh, we expect the results to be like this, and you're going to be compared to national average or whatever. Oh, and by the way, it's a teacher assessment, so you have total control over this. And we know that moderation, you go, oh, well, we were moderated, but what does moderation even mean? We know that there's massive variations and I know that it's been improved, but there are still issues. Anecdotally, if you speak to head teachers in different areas, you get different messages about this. So yeah, I think that I personally think that the primary accountability system is broken because it's over-reliance on teacher assessment.
Using assessment in the accountability system is clearly problematic, as you saw with the GCSE results, A-level results the last 2 years.
Oh yeah,
yes. That was just the thing writ large, wasn't it? And that's the problem, as you're saying, Jeremy. The incentives all over the place are difficult. So using teacher assessment for statutory purposes is really, really problematic.
Yeah, and I just think there needs to be a massive overhaul. We referred to quite a lot the report by EDSK, which, whether that's the right answer or not, where you just scrap the entire primary accountability system and you replace it with more regular online adaptive tests. Now, we know that you can use sampling. You don't necessarily have to have all children doing all the tests. If you want to have individual measures of schools year on year, then you basically have to have all children doing the test all the time. But if you just want to monitor national standards, the impact of the curriculum, changes over time, the gap between disadvantaged children, then you can just do sampling. I mean, that's another encouraging thing, actually, Ofsted have taken, is that if you remember RAISE, all of the data in RAISE was broken down into every conceivable subgroup of children. And there was pages, 60 pages of data that was broken down to pupil group level. If you look at the IDSR, the Inspection Data Summary Report now, there's nothing on groups unless they only deal with 4 groups. They only deal with disadvantaged children and low, middle, and high prior retainers. Now, those low, middle, high prior retainers are based on Key Stage 1 results, which therefore I have a massive problem with. But they're only dealing with those groups, and they will only print a statement about those groups. They'll only sort of say that there's something interesting about those groups if their results are significantly different to the school as a whole and the national average and whatever. So they have to meet quite tight criteria. And the chances are those groups are often so small, their confidence intervals are so wide that they have to deviate so far from those averages that they're never highlighted, as never flagged up as being an issue anyway. So that's, I think, is a good approach. But still, I mentioned, I've mentioned governors. This is a big thing of mine now. Most head teachers will break data down, and it will be based on teacher assessment. They'll break all this data down into all these different subgroups of pupils, and they'll say, oh, boys are doing better than girls in this subject, and girls are doing better than boys in this subject, and some are born boys and, disadvantaged, middle prior retaining, spring born, whatever's. It's crazy stuff. It doesn't mean anything.
There's a lot less of that, isn't there? Partly there's a lot of work
but it's still going
on. And others have done to say, groups make sense at a national level, at a population level, but trying to do them in a schools are small samples and so on. So therefore, luckily that is moving forward. Anyway, so the message there is, if you are a school leader who's still breaking things down into groups which have got these small numbers, then just stop doing it. It's not going to help you broadly. Look at the national picture and see if that has any indication for what you might want to do. But looking at the school level doesn't make sense.
But even at the sort of the aggregated levels, so governors, you need to show them something. You need to provide them with some indication of standards across the school. They have a responsibility to monitor this and to challenge. I am a primary school, so are you, but basing that on teacher assessment is really problematic, because one of the things I joke about this a lot is that there was a target that was going around for quite a while, and it still seems to pop up, the 85% thing, right? 85% of children need to be expected standards. 85% of children need to make expected progress, whatever expected progress is, it doesn't exist. But anyway, so you hear these things all the time. And then sure enough, at the end of year 3, 85% of children are working at expected standards. At the end of year 4, 85% working at expected standards. At the end of year 5, 85% working at expected standards. At the end of year 6, 52% meet the expected standard in the tests. Because it's based on a test. And up until that point, you're being sold something that is based on teacher assessment that is being distorted to give a possibly rose-tinted view of things, because the teacher is thinking, that's what I've got to show. I've been told that 85% children have got, so therefore, wait, look at that. I press the button and there they are, 85%. Just right. Not too hot, not too cold, just right.
Yeah, I mean, you've almost confirmed what I thought, but I'm totally on board, Richard, with the ones and zeros, as a way of using that assessment in a meaningful way. It makes a whole lot of sense. On the other hand, I think standardized testing is probably the first the first option when it comes to getting a picture of how pupils have done, in terms of their attainment. Is there anything I'm missing? Is there anything we should be worried about? Obviously, Sir Jamie, you've mentioned a few times about standardized testing and not over relying on them. What do we need to know to get the most from standardized testing in schools?
Well, one of the things that concerns me is about for a start, the select. How did you select the test? Why did you choose that particular test? If you just chose it because everyone else is doing that test, then that's not a good enough reason to choose it. There are budget issues. They cost a lot of money. So are you getting value for money? If you're spending thousands on these things, is that money that could be spent elsewhere? If there is value in them, and I hope that there is value in them, there's questions around the administration of the test. So you need to ensure that those tests are being administered in the same way across the school. And if you are in a MAT, I think it's almost essential. You can't compare all these different schools across a MAT on the basis of teacher assessment. I just don't believe you can. Just don't believe it works. So you need to use the same tests. You don't need to do them every term necessarily, maybe once a year. That can provide you with some information about the standards in each school. That's that's useful. But you need to ensure that they are being administered in a consistent way around about the same time. So you'd have probably a week window when you do them, and administered in under, fairly strict conditions. You can't have one school where they're administering it under strict conditions, another school where they're sat around in groups and copying each other and looking over each other's shoulders. You just can't do that. The other thing that we focus on quite a lot is and Richard can come in and talk about this, is the question level or item level analysis of the test. So the test companies provide tools to do this, where you mentioned ones and zeros a minute ago. All of these questions are boiled down to a 1 or a 0, which you can then put onto a spreadsheet that you can then upload into a system that then shows how your results compare to their reference sample or everyone else who took the test. And you can see that 22% of children got that question right, where nationally it's 57% or whatever, and that might be a cause for concern. Or it might be that you just haven't really focused on that in your curriculum up until that point. So that's another thing. What people need to make, I'll get Rich to come in and talk about this. People need to understand what the primary purpose of a standardized test is. And it's not necessarily to test children's curriculum knowledge, because how can it? Because it's not designed around your curriculum. It's to compare children to a national reference sample to see, broadly speaking, where your children compare or sit within a national population. I don't know if you want to talk more about that, Richard.
So there's a number of things to say, so I'll get to that. But the first thing I'm going to say is, I think some of the work which we do is to say to people, they're called standardized tests for a reason. The reason why they exist is because we now know that the answer to the question, what distorts testing, is pretty much everything. Everything distorts testing. So when you do them, how children be prepared, who's administering the test, how they administer the test, time of day, all kinds of different things affect a standardized assessment. So therefore, the reason why they're called standardized tests, and it's fairly evident, but it's worth repeating, is because you need to standardize a lot of things to try and minimize the bias that will inevitably creep into any assessment. So you do that, so you're trying to remove the bias as much as possible. So that's the first thing. And then, lots of different, you can standardize lots of different tests. If you standardize the administration, standardize the way you mark them, and so on. So when we talk about standardized tests, often we're talking about external providers who've done a norm reference test. And again, if you want to know some more detail about what those things mean, it's in our book and you can read up on it. But you can standardize other ways. I standardize assessments where I standardize whether pupils know what the alphabet looks like. So I get them to write lowercase and uppercase letters in a standard way so that I can see if there's a change over time. There's all kinds of standardization that you can do. But if we're talking about kind of a standardized assessment which most people think about as you're sitting down to do an assessment and to take that assessment formally, you want to minimize bias. And what you're trying to do is to try and use the information from the assessment. So there's a number of things you need to know. Firstly, as Jamie said, that the test isn't assessing what the pupils know. It's not assessing that. That's not what standardized assessments do. They might be aligned to a curriculum, but it's probably not your curriculum, and it may be the national curriculum, but it's not trying to check what you know. And it's worth knowing this, and I'll say this, it's a standardish line that I say, if you've got an item on a test, it isn't trying to check whether you know the answer to this question. It's trying to check, are you the kind of pupil who can answer this question correctly? And it's a key distinction. So that's what it's trying to do. Are you the kind of people who can answer this correctly? And then we can use that information to build a picture to say, broadly within the national population, as a result of the answers that you've given on this assessment, at this point, it looks like you're in the middle, you're at the front, you're towards the back. And that's all it does. And that's really useful information, because you as a teacher have been assessing them. You have a view, are they in the middle, at the front, at the back? But then you can check against your biases using a standardized assessment. If it's a decent one and it does it well in particular subjects, you can then, as I say, use that to use your own biases. As long as you understand that that's what the assessment's doing, and that it's not assessing you as a teacher and whether you're any good at your job and whether you're successful and whether you have any self-worth. It's just trying to place the child on a continuum and give you some information, which hopefully you can then put together with other information to let you know roughly where you should be putting your effort in school. So again, that's kind of broadly what I'd say with standardized tests. They are really, really useful, even though they're limited. We only really can do them in primary schools in reading and in maths, and then in also kind of more general cognitive abilities testing. which is really useful because it still, can work pretty well. But it's very hard to find a standardized test in history or, art, for example. But using the English test and reading test can be useful. And if you want to use something like comparative judgment, which is a different discussion, but it gives you a standardized score in writing, that can be really useful because, again, as we said earlier on in this discussion, primary schools, yes, are about reading, writing, and adding up, and we want to know whether you can do those things. We also want to socialize you into school and do lots of other things, but we want to know those things, and standardized assessments can tell you where people fit on a continuum. So the downside to them, and you can look into these, and there's lots of things. Few of the last things to say is that yes, there's an aspect of just your general attitude towards test taking as a primary school child. We've all taught, if you taught in primary schools, you'll know that there are some children in year 3, year 2, year 5, year 6 even, who couldn't give a monkeys about the test, and therefore the test might not be particularly reliable. But for a typical child, they can give you some useful results. Also, it does depend on your access, your understanding of English and the way its tests are written sometimes. So there are some downsides, and definitely as long as you're careful about the results you've got, then they can be useful. And again, one of the ways we say to be careful is if you've got 2, 3, 4 years worth of standardized assessments for pupils, you should have a rough idea as to, well, how do these children generally score in a reading test or a maths test? Is there any change? Is there anything we need to know? So I don't think there's anything else I particularly want to say. There's a whole bunch of stuff. Again, with this whole chapter, Jamie wrote a brilliant chapter with loads of questions and answers. So if people are interested, there's a chapter in the book which just covers pretty much all the things you need to know about standardized tests in primary school.
One of the things I would mention is about how, so there's sort of different parts to standardization. There's the standardization of the results, which converts the raw results into a standardized score. There's the test itself. Obviously, that's just simply, in most cases, that's ensuring that all children attempt the same set of questions, which is, you think, well, of course. But there are cases where that's not happening. So if you do online adaptive tests, that's not happening. They'll be confronted with different questions according to their ability and the answers they previously gave. That's fine. So things like GLs, NGRT tests, those are adaptive STAR assessment. But the other one is children with special educational needs that are working below the age-appropriate curriculum are often given a test that was intended for a younger child. So you've got a year 5 child who's working 2 or 3 years below the age-appropriate curriculum, so they're given a year 2 test. Well, it may be that there are questions on that paper that are appropriate and it's useful to see how they attempt those, maybe, but the score means nothing because that's not how standardization works. The standardization of the age-appropriate test includes children who are working well below as well as children who are working well above, and that's how you manage to standardize it. There are, of course, children who can't access it, and for those children, it's fine if you want to get them to do that year 2 paper, but just there's not really any point in taking that score, that raw score, even taking the raw score, really. There's no point in that. But then to take that raw score of 22 out of 50 or whatever and convert it into, oh, they got a score of 97. That's just telling you they're broadly in line with, 7-year-olds. It doesn't really mean anything, and it's not really designed. That's not really how it's designed to work. The other thing,
a lot of, isn't it, Jamie? Because I'll say that again, standardized tests are really useful for assessing those people who are kind of in the middle of this, but they're not good at the top end and they're not good at the lower end. But therefore, you as a teacher, as a school, you need to make some decisions about, well, what are we going to do there? Because you might want to administer those assessments, but if you've got a child who's getting everything right, then the assessment may actually not be giving, might not be educationally useful for them. Equally, if a child's really struggling to answer anything, then they're going to struggle as well. So it is worth considering that, I say, standard assessments, pretty good in the middle. The adaptive tests are slightly better, but even then, for the extreme ends of the distribution, the assessments, you need to consider what you're doing with that. Sorry, Jamie.
No, the other thing that I'm concerned about is how the company that provide the test, how they have the sample on which they've standardized it. That's another thing that concerns me. So how big is it? How was it selected? Because most companies, they're quite rigorous, that they will go through a process, usually every couple of years. They'll contact a bunch of schools, they'll identify children, they'll build a reference sample that is sort of stratified and representative and got all the right proportions of children in the right places and what have you. So you know that the results, when you compare your results of your children against that, it is a good proxy for the sort of the national picture. But I'm not sure that's what all companies are doing. And if it's a case that it may or may not be an issue, but if it's a case that you're just being standardized against like all the other schools that chose to buy that company's tests, then that is not necessarily representative. If they've got thousands of schools, and there probably is, but if it's a smaller number, that it might be that those tests are particularly popular in schools that are requires improvement, that are in, you know, more deprived areas, or are all in the east of England or whatever. You know, it might be that they're all geographically clustered, in which case then it probably isn't nationally representative. And the other is the timing. So when was it last standardized? You know, is it a good rigorous standardization process? And it may be that it is a good rigorous standardization process, but if that took place last time that was done was 5 or 6 years ago, then things have moved on since then. And then you're probably it may be kind of exaggerating your performance. It may be flattering you, you know, that things aren't as good as you think. So that's another thing to consider. As I say, most of the popular ones, they're rigorous in how they do this. So I just have concerns that maybe not all.
Yeah, I mean, you can see the thread going through, you know, because you've spoken quite a bit about accountability. When teachers do see quite often the test results as a reflection, like you say, Richard, of their performance, then you don't get anything, you know, and it, like you said, warps how they go. But you can see that, you know, if we take the approach you guys have outlined, you know, both here and in your fantastic book, then you have a better chance, don't you? And teachers have a lot less personal at stake in the results of those tests, because like you said, one of the questions they will quite often ask me is, well, we haven't covered this, and then the conversation we've just had, it explains why that's not necessarily important. But when your performance management is based on whether or not you've covered that and whether or not they get that question right, it's a totally different story. So yeah,
I mean, it's really scary to think that there might be teachers that are held to account on the basis of the results of, you know, some commercial standardized tests that they've, you know, that really worries me.
Exactly. And unfortunately, that was kind of built into the expectations because of you know, the policies, educational policies of the mid-2010s. Again, you know, you're expected to have numerical targets in teachers' performance management and so on, and you were tied to your pupils' results, and that was part of an experiment that was happening in the States and a bit here as well. But I think we have moved beyond that, and you'd hope that most schools now would recognise that actually that what that does is it puts perverse impedences into place and it distorts things. It's not a sensible way to use data or to use the information you've got. You know, the assessment is of the child. It is not of the teacher or the teaching. And again, the more you move the assessment away from trying to use it as some kind of performance management tool, as you say, Jamie, what's your line with this? You can have good data or you can use it for performance management.
Yeah, that's your choice. Yeah, you can have nice, accurate teacher assessment information, or you can use it for performance management and accountability. It's up to you. That's your choice. And sadly, there are schools that still make the wrong choice there. You mentioned targets there. I've got a little pithy sort of point of view on this, that there is only one target in a primary school that's measurable. That's for all children to meet expected standards. So if you want a target, 100%, that's it. You know, and as far as I'm concerned as a governor, that's the target. I'm not going to hold anyone to account on that, but it's not target anyway. It's an expectation. The expectation is that all children meet expected standards. Yeah. I remember a head teacher telling me this story that she said that she used to have this in her school development plan. The first few pages would all be this kind of target setting mumbo jumbo. You know, she would have all these different subjects, all the different year groups, and all the different year groups broken down into all these different subgroups, and then some made up percentage, like 78% of this group, 72% of this group, 85% of this group, blah, 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 blah. And she just said, in the end, she just scrapped it all and she changed it. And now it just says, she's got this one statement, so all children that sit tests will achieve expected standards. That's it. Obviously, children who don't sit tests, probably pre-key stage, they can't do. So I like that. All children that sit tests will meet expected standards. That's the expectation that's embedded across the school. That's what we're working towards. Why do you need targets? 100%.
Perfect. Yeah, it's like that conversation about Key stage 2 tests are across the whole key stage, so what can you expect to know by October of year 3 and that kind of thing, sort of
But obviously
resetting
what
your
we don't
sights.
want is everyone being held to account on like, well, why aren't 100% of your children meeting expected standards then? That's the difficult thing, isn't it?
Michael Gove and everybody's above average. Even if that, yeah, exactly. But yeah.
Although in theory, all children can meet expected standards. It's not norm referenced.
Yeah, it's true.
And the government, what's going to happen with this, but have set this expectation now, 90% by 2030.
They're just providing useful political spades for people over the head with in many years' time. The hilarious thing is, a government that's been in charge for 12 years that has got nowhere near that kind of number has put that target in. But no, that's unfortunate. That again gives you a sense as I was saying earlier, that education just isn't a political focus at the moment, because they do things like that, and you realise that it's just small people, well, big P politics. It's not actually anything useful.
We've had various factions in charge over the last few years. That's the thing. Right? It's not one government. Various factions of supposedly a party.
Yeah, that's unfortunately politicians and education. A lot of the time, again, it's a whole different discussion. But yes, unfortunately, the whole kind of setting targets like that doesn't make sense.
I think that there was a really good blog post by TDaPE on how achievable the 90% is. And based on previous data, based on like 2019 data, when you look at what percentage of children achieve expected standard in at least one subject, you think, oh, right, well, it is doable then. It's doable. But then COVID happened. And now we've dropped back down to, what was it, 59% achieving expected standards in all 3 this year? You're a million miles away.
A couple of times we've mentioned sort of tracking systems, and as far back as I can remember, they've been central in schools' approach. Is it possible, and this might be a bit of a loaded question, to have a tracking system that is genuinely useful and doesn't put unfair workload expectations on teachers, just like those we've described across this?
All right. Should I kick off with this?
Yeah.
I'll be honest. I work for a company that provides a tracking system. So I work for Insight. And there is a reason why I work for them. I think that they do have the right approach. Unfortunately, most systems, and understandable under levels, they all were doing it, bet the farm on the progress measure thing. That what the purpose of a tracking system is to measure how many steps of progress, i.e. sub levels or whatever a point of progress is. That's the purpose of a tracking system, is to measure how much progress you'll make. So after levels were removed, everyone, as you mentioned earlier, they just set about recreating them. That's what they did. They just recreated them in a different name. Some of them just maintained the same. I think there was one that just maintained the same point score system, but just called the sub-level something else. But they called them, year 2 emerging plus and year 3 developing minus or whatever. But they had the same point scale underneath, or even half points. This child is on 22.5 points and they need to get to 25 point, whatever. Absolute crazy stuff, right? And then I had a conversation with a school that was doing exactly this recently, and I can't remember. They had something like they had like a B, C, and then a C, D, and a D. All these weird. And I said to the guy, could your teachers tell me, if I was to ask them, would there be a point in a child's book and say the difference, show me the difference, Y2B/C and a Y2C/D? And he said, no. What they do is they just move them up 1 point every term. So that's what they do. They just tick the box, up they go. So that's what tracking systems sort of bet the farm on, that that's what the purpose was, and that's been maintained. I think that the purpose of a so-called tracking system is to store all of your useful information in one place. That's what it's a database where you have access to all that useful contextual information. Richard talks a lot about this, about having not just access to assessment data, attainment results, maybe, but all that rich and useful attendance data and contextual history. Results of prior attainment, such as it is, foundation stage, key stage 1 phonics, all that sort of stuff. Any results of standardized tests and teacher assessments, reading ages, CAT scores, I don't know, various SEND specific assessments. There are loads. YARC and I'm going to rattle off a few. YARC and FAB and Boxall and Wellcome and Sandwell and Salford and all these different things that schools do that are not just focused on reading and maths, but also like well-being and all those sorts of things as well. Any information that you think is useful should be stored in your system and should be readily accessible by anyone who has access to that system. So I don't think you should have bits locked down. Obviously, you can't have governors logging in, but all teachers should have equal access to all that information. So it's not just that the year 5 teacher sees what the year 4 teacher said, but has a complete history of everything that went before. So you can see that, your phrase, Richard, journey over time. So you can see that journey through school over time building up, that picture building up. That's what a system needs to do. That means it needs to be really flexible and capable of storing any data in any format. When you put test scores in, the school should be able to set whatever thresholds they like. So if a child got below this percentage or this score, they're a X, and if they're between this and this, they're a Y, and if they got a score above that, then they're a Z. They should be able to store any data in any format, define it in any way they like, make sure that the language and the descriptors and the bandings or whatever they're using reflect what they're using in the school. There should be no cases where they're having to make compromises, or we call it this, but the system calls it that, and we just have to do a kind of conversion in our head, go, yeah, I know it says that, but actually what it means is it should be totally flexible, customizable, and capable of storing all that information. So it becomes a library. And that's particularly important. We mentioned earlier, there are a lot of children that are just fine. You don't need vast amounts of information on them, but it should be it certainly therefore should be capable of storing more granular information on particularly children with special educational needs, provision mapping, their learning plans, their individual learning journeys and curriculum and all that sort of thing. So there's a lot that a tracking system can do, and that's something that we're trying to address. But measuring progress is a long way down my list because I don't think that we can measure progress. So the thing that I don't think we can do, that I think has been a massive red herring and a massive distraction, is what most systems are focused on. Maybe less so now, but I still think that's the big deal. That's the kind of the hub on which the wheel is built. And sadly, if you speak to a lot of teachers, you can say, well, I need to be able to measure progress, but you can't measure progress. But you have to measure progress. But how do you measure progress? Define what progress is. If you want to measure something, first of all, you need to define it. Then you need to have a unit of measurement, and then you need some way of measuring it. We can't do any of those things. So why bother trying? Just have a library of lots of useful information, and hopefully that's useful.
Yeah, you need an assessment database, which previously would have been called a tracking system. The whole tracking thing ends up with people just get into this progress mindset. And again, the thing which we keep talking about is saying that you need to move away from a progress mindset. That's an external measure that's used by others for their own reasons. You need to move away from that to an action mindset, which is basically to say, as a result of the information we've collected, these are the changes we have made or we haven't made. This class is fine. There's nothing that we need to do additional for this class other than they need to be in school, in class, focused learning, and our curriculum, which we've worked really hard on, will do the job. But this class, there are 5, 6 children in that class who this is their history. This is the reason why they need to have some changes. So we're changing the curriculum slightly. We're changing the timetable slightly. We're changing the focus of that class slightly because of this. We made that decision. We make that decision once a year or however often you need to do it. And then we put that decision into place. And then we just keep track of that. And that's what your tracking system is, keeping track of the actions that you've taken, the data which you gathered, the way it's, the analysis which came out of it, the actions that you put in place, and that you've got those. Because the worst thing again is, if you're a year 4 teacher, you should know which pupils struggled in, year 1 reception. You should know what their phonics scores is. That information should be available to you quickly. You should have a broad picture of that class to say, is this a class that needs changes to be made, or is this a class that we just need to make sure that they're doing the things which we want them to do. So that's where we're looking at saying, you have to gather information. You've got to keep it somewhere. You've got to turn it into an action-based focus, not a progress focus.
If what you're storing isn't having any impact on learning, then just don't do it. There's no point.
And you need to be very clear about what you are going to collect. You need to sit it down as a school, work out, okay, let's collect this information. You need to future-proof that so that you can do that for the next 5 years. 6 years, 7 years, because the pupils you're going to have, if you've got a through primary and if you've got 7 years of pupils, you need to know that in 7 years' time, that year 6 teacher will have 7 years worth of really decent data. The last thing, again, there's too much chopping and changing in primary schools where, in schools generally, where schools do something, but well, it's only been happening now, or there's no history. You need the history. So therefore, sit down, work out what you're going to collect, limit that information. So there's you're not collecting everything. As I say, you don't need to collate all the information which teachers have got in their head, but you need to collect certain bits of information, and you need to make sure you agree with what that is, and then put it into a database. I've been doing a big project with a Matt over the last 3 years, putting loads of these things which we put into our system in place, and it's extraordinary. When you look down at a child in year 3 and you can say, okay, these are assessments we've got from year 1, these are the assessments we've got from year 2, now they're in year 3, this is the journey of this child, this is what it looks like in year 6, and I'm so looking forward to seeing that database in 5 years' time, when we've just got the information that you need, useful information you're going to act on, and we're not just gathering loads of stuff that nobody is ever going to look at or do anything with, which is what used to happen far too much.
One of the things that really worries me is when you speak to a head and they say, well, yeah, the teachers don't really have anything to do with that. They just like send me all this on a spreadsheet or whatever, and then I upload it into the system, and then I use this and I report to governors and whatever. But yeah, the teachers don't need to worry about any of this. What we're trying to talk about is changing the culture around data in schools from one where the teachers view it with suspicion about what are they doing with this data, to one where they actually view it as a useful tool, where it's this kind of open source thing, that they see that there's value in it. I think all too often they're not seeing that. They go, well, we put some information in, I don't know what happens to it. And we need to switch that round. We need to change the culture around data in schools to stop this kind of quite cynical. And as I say, it's therefore prone to manipulation and distortion, to one where it's seen as being a powerful, useful tool, and where the emphasis is on accuracy. There's not going to be any comeback on you. We need this to be, and then hopefully we'll start to use that data better, and it will become more accurate, more reliable, and the whole culture around data will shift.
I've sort of tried to structure these questions around the sort of the key parts of the book, without, give you opportunity to talk about them, but without going the whole way, so that people are basically listening for free to the whole book. But what would your guiding principles for developing an effective approach be? So if you could almost condense what we've discussed into sort of some really clear points for listeners who are ready to sort of up their assessment game.
I'm going to jump in there because when I work with schools and when we talk about things, I work with schools to say you need to think about your data strategically, because the information which you gather and you collate and you analyze, it should underpin a load of things which you're doing in school. Yes, you're developing a great curriculum, and yes, you're supporting pupils in their development as people, but you need information, and you need to gather that information, and it needs to underpin what you need to do. And if you think about it strategically, because it will help you in all features of what you're doing in the school. So the first thing you need to do is sit down and say, okay, what do we want from our data? And I often talk about in 1 year, 3 years, 10 years. What will this look like in 10 years' time? And again, that's always a useful question for a lot of people in school, because 10 years is quite a long time, and people don't tend to think in 10-year chunks. But it's worth thinking about, well, what does this look like in 10 years' time? Because if it's worth doing, it should last that length of time at least. But I say, sit down with a data strategy, work out where you are, and then work out how you're going to change what you're doing. I say, if you're still in a bit of a progress focus, if you've ended up with that, if you're using your tracking system to effectively track what you think teachers are teaching, or what teachers might have guessed children are able to do, because you've got a huge range of criteria that you're using, you're tracking that information. Move away from that progress tracking, move away from that using the data to keep track of your teachers. Move into an action focus to say, okay, what we're going to then do is think about pupils who are fine and know who they are, and pupils who are not fine. People who are not fine, what are we actually doing about that? And how do we keep that information current, so that we in the school understand the challenges for a class, for a cohort, for a key stage, and for the school as a whole. If you're a MAT as well, you can also then look at the different challenges across the different schools you've got, because some schools, you know, their challenges are quite significant. They're quite, there's a lot of things that you need to think about. But for other schools, it's more straightforward. You can actually do much less with your data and spend much less time on your data, so that over time you should be maximizing your use of the data, but minimizing the effort which you take on the data, so that you can spend more time doing the things which you actually want to focus on. So broadly, that's what I'd say. Again, thinking about, I say, a strategic approach to it, and trying to set up a system such that in 5-10 years time, you're not doing a lot. You just, the system is running itself.
I would, in terms of the practicalities, teachers are no doubt going to be recording some kind of overall assessment, whatever format that is. Try to avoid some recreation of levels. But you're basically recording whether that child is, you know, fine or, you know, high or low or whatever, in reading, writing and maths. Most schools are doing that termly. Question whether you need to do it termly, maybe twice a year, I don't know, but whatever is useful, in reading, writing and maths anyway. In foundation subjects, I mean, what can you really record? Whether the child is on track or not, that's it, probably once a year. You know, so you really don't need much information on that at all. It's worth recording if you're using your system to produce parent reports, which is something that, you know, systems can do. That's one good function of a system. If all your data is in that one place, then you can use that system, and you can also record in the system the commentary that teachers are making about child's learning. Then you can compile that all into a parent report, something that Insight does quite well. And then, so therefore, you probably want to record effort grades as well. So, or effort or attitude to learning. I don't know what you want to call that, but maybe something on behavior. I don't know. But if that's what's important and that's what you report to parents, then you probably want to record all that in there as well. Think about using a standardized test. It doesn't need to be every term necessarily, but maybe at the end of year, just as something to kind of shore up teacher assessment or validate teacher assessment, or something to balance it and check it. You know, that's a useful thing to do in reading and in maths. But make sure that you can also, you know, record all those sort of assessments relating to children with SEND. Okay, so those will often be in the form of scores and reading ages. That's all fine. The one thing I really want schools to think about, I'm looking at primary schools here, this is not a secondary thing, is the checking off of these learning statements, these learning objectives, which is still rife. This kind of digital APP, which has just sort of gone mad, and I'm not quite sure why it happened. I think there's something around the levels of confidence around assessment that for some reason you need, rather than being able to make this overall assessment of a child's position, they're learning in maths, you need to have it broken down into all these different like subsets, these increments, and you go, oh, they're working at greater depth in that one, and they're meeting that one, and they're working below in that one. The risk of that is it does turn into a progress thing where like you get extra points the more boxes you tick, which is really worrying. The other thing is there are systems out there that take how many boxes you've ticked, work out what percentage of the total number of objects there are, and then change that into some kind of, convert that into some kind of auto grade. So the system is calculated based on some flaky, and it's usually like, have they achieved 33% of their objectives by Christmas? Like, why 33%? Well, if you take 100%, divide by 3 terms, 33%. You go, oh yeah, so that's how your curriculum is designed and delivered in all year groups and all subjects, is it? No. But so there are loads of concerns around, you know, why schools are doing that. That's a big focus. I would say the majority of primary schools are still doing that. They don't like to admit it, but it's a huge workload issue as well. So Solomon Kingsnorth did a really good blog on this, and he gave the example of if you have 30 learning objectives for 30 children, that's 900 assessments times 3 subjects, 2,700 assessments. Do it 3 times a year, that's 8,100 assessments you're going to have to record in a system. Now that's probably, you know, over exaggerating it maybe, because you're not going to be doing each of those each term, but in some cases you might be. But don't even, that's just for like say year 3 or whatever. But foundation stage, 17 early learning goals broken down into all these developmental statements. It's crazy. I multiplied that up for one school once. It came to 45,600 records. And no one's going to do that. So what you're going to do is you're just going to block fill it. And we know that's what they do in reality. They just wait till the end of term, select all, and just, yeah, they're all done those. In which case, what's the point? So I think that's something that schools really need to look at. And they need to ask themselves, are you just going through the motions here? Is there any value in doing this? Is it possible that this is not really telling teachers anything they didn't already know because it's based on what they knew in the first place? There's no way that a teacher can tick off all these things, look away, look back and go, oh, I didn't know that. So why do it? So that's something I really want schools to think about. And we talk about that in the book a lot as well.
I think that's solid advice. And I love, Richard, you're talking about 10 years time. You know, very rarely do we ever get to see things the whole way through to completion, you know, but I think where a head teacher goes in and they have a 10-year mindset, you know, things get done and things get done properly, you know, because, you know, you don't change things overnight. Rome wasn't built in a day. And we've just finished a 5-year project. And at the end of the 5 years, supporting these teachers in their math teaching, you know, they now do not need anyone to support them because they're the experts now, if that makes sense. And I wish that happened more often, you know, so it's great to hear you talk about that there. And my youngest is in reception, and I'm just thinking about his school report now and whether or not he was just, you know, every box, you know, at the end of the year, let's tick all the, so maybe do some assessment on him when he gets home today. So just to sort of round off, got this sort of policy influence and fantasy question. If you were schools minister, because it might be your turn next very, very soon, who knows, you know, is there a list?
I have no ambitions at this stage.
I can neither confirm nor deny.
That's like having the backing of your board as if the football manager, you know, by the next Monday you're gone.
Oh yeah, exactly. I love that full backing.
So if you're school's minister, you've got a mandate to change assessment for the better. What's your plan of action?
Well, I'm going to jump in here because again, it's something which I wrote a piece about this last year because I was just looking at things and just again, it's really interesting. Lots of change come because people come up with ideas and suggest them to the government. They take them on. In primary, there just hasn't been that much discussion about assessment in the last while. There's a really good report by Tom Richmond at EDSK, which Jamie mentioned earlier, and again, people should look for that, which talks about primary assessment and how we might move forward. And he puts forward an interesting model, which, as Jamie said, is kind of a rolling assessment model, which you do as you move through. My thought is just the way which we've changed. As Jamie said, there's a lot of assessment in primary now. But the reason why we've got a lot of assessment is because, so in 2 cases, so the phonics screening check was brought in basically as a policy nudge to ensure that schools were teaching phonics in a particular way. The multiplication check, screening check has also been put in place. And that's been put in place in year 4, again, for a similar kind of reason to ensure that teachers. So assessments are being used in that way, which is interesting. So that's one thing. The second thing is that we've then we've dealt with the fact that there was a problem at Key Stage 1, because if we used assessments at Key Stage 1, it distorted things. So we've taken that away, we're taking it away, and we put in place this reception baseline assessment, which is problematic in all kinds of ways, but at the same time, it's a number because the government just wants a number at the beginning and a number at the end. So it's created a number. So when I had a good look at it, I thought, actually, so at the moment we've got this big Key Stage 2 assessment system that's just basically designed to create a number that can be used at the beginning of to measure from a government point of view. And from a government point of view, measuring progress across primary schools, whilst it's problematic, that's what they do, that's what they want to do, and they're probably not going to stop wanting to do that. So they've got a number to do the end stage of Key Stage of primary and the beginning stage of secondary. So the logical extension of that is to say, well, if you put a reception baseline assessment in, why don't we put a Key Stage 2 baseline assessment in and do something similar? Get an iPad, create some questions, give it to your 11-year-olds and say, here you go, push these buttons for 20 minutes, and then that will produce a number. Nobody knows what that number is except the government wonks, who will then use that to say whether you've made much progress through primary schools. And actually, I think there's a lot of benefit that can come from that from a government point of view, because then they get rid of all the distortion at Key Stage 2 and they move something, they move on. So I think that would be worth investigating, because if all you want is a number at the end of Key Stage 2, which is largely what you want, do that. Of course, the reason why we have the assessments at Key Stage 2 is because we do want pupils to be able to read and to write and so on. But I think there's something to be said for taking, from a statutory point of view, for taking away that a distortion that we've got at the moment. But I'm also very aware, as ever, that Sam Friedman's very good with this, who, again, those people who read Sam Friedman, saying you need to be very aware of unintended consequences. Any changes that you make may just cause more chaos. And so therefore, yes, the system which we have is flawed. But if you're going to put something else in place, you need to be certain that it's not going to create more chaos. So I don't know. So I think it's a tricky one. It's a tricky one. But if I was looking for an interesting thing, I would say, yeah, let's just do a year 6 baseline assessment. That's my view. What do you think, Jamie? Have you got any?
Yeah. So when you say year 6 baseline assessment,
well, baseline for secondary, or like a year 6.
So why not do it at the beginning of year 7?
Or even better, do it at the beginning of year 7. Exactly. Yeah. Take it out of primary schools.
I do think that statutory assessment it's been kind of implemented in such a piecemeal kind of way. It's just like stuff getting bolted on all the time. I think it's got to the point now, it's just kind of got out of hand. There's so many assessment points. It's just madness. And I do like you're right, there'll be unintended consequences, no doubt, and that needs to be looked at. But I do like is a certain elegance to the proposed solution in that EDSK report. We have online adaptive tests, English and maths, every couple of years. It does mean that you'd need to think about whether you're going to have a reception baseline as well, and whether that could be done, because there was actually an iPad based one, wasn't there?
Yeah.
When we originally had this round of the multiple provider approach, it was doomed to failure. Everyone knew it would fail, and they went ahead with anyone. You could select your provider, and the vast majority just selected one, and then there were just a few others, just sort of, other schools were just like fighting over the other providers, fighting over scraps, really. But then one of them was, I think it was GL had a sort of an iPad based approach. But I do like the idea that you have regular but fairly low stakes assessment, that you don't have to have all children corralled. You don't have to have them all do it at the same time. You could have 5 do it on one day and then another 5 do it on another. It can fit in better with the sort of day-to-day sort of runnings of a classroom. I like that idea. Other countries, I think they said, was it Wales are going down this route? Yeah. Australia have, Denmark, so a few other countries that have done this. So maybe every 2 years you do some kind of online adaptive assessment, which includes they said they include reference questions. So you have the same question repeated every year so that you can then measure standards over time. I like that. I think if we were to keep, I really like the idea of sampling. We have sampling for science. I don't know, do we really need all children assessed all of the time, every year? I guess in the current system we have, we can't see past it. That's how it's built. Every child in the end of year 6 is assessed, and then we have these school measures, and that's why I think we need to take a really big look at, and this would be my number one, my big ticket item, which we need to take a really hard look at the performance, the performance tables, the influence of the performance tables and what that's doing to education. I'm not anti-accountability. I think that the performance tables are badly presented. I think there should be some kind of contextual summary of a school before they even get into any data. But where you get to this landing page and it's got these minus 1.8 well below. And no one knows, well, the intended audience, there aren't that many people that know what minus 1.8 means. So they ignore the minus 1.8 and they just see red and they see well below. So they don't understand about the issues between reading and writing, and about writing being based on teacher assessment. They don't understand how children with SEND that are working below, that don't sit tests, that are still included in these measures by being assigned basically a made-up score according to their pre-key stage assessment, how that will massively impact. If you've got a resource base unit in your school for children with SEND, how that's included, not excluded, that's included in your results, all of this stuff. There's so many problems, so many structural problems with the way that these measures are calculated. And I really, I know there are some people who want performance tables to remain. I don't think there are many teachers that do. I think the world would be a better place without them on balance. I think the world would be a better place if we move towards sample testing rather than universal testing. That does, though, cause a problem. If you were to do that, it does cause a problem for secondary if you're going to have a progress 8 measure, because you need every child to have, so that means they'd have to have some kind of they'd have to have an entry assessment in secondary, which I don't think they'd be against anyway, because loads of secondary schools have a problem with Key Stage 2 SATs and that being used. Thinking out loud here, I quite like the idea of not having a question bank of Key Stage 2 test questions rather than having the papers available online. I think you need to do, if we're going to maintain this current system, I think something needs to be done about the amount of test practice that goes on. And having a question bank so you can practice questions, but you don't know how you can. It's that adding them up and then creating a scaled score and then saying, oh, this child got 97, they just need 3 more to get to a express. I think that's all worrying. There's also systems stuff that I would change. So we currently have this absolute mess where you've got a primary assessment gateway that doesn't really work very well, and we've got a tables checking website, and we've got performance tables, and we've got ASP, and we've got the IDSR, and they're all in different bloody places. And for some reason, schools still submit their foundation stage and phonics and Key Stage 1 results to local authorities. Why isn't everything just done through this primary assessment gateway? Everything uploaded to it, downloaded from it, viewed on it, everything done on there. Maybe that's where they're heading, but that really needs to be solved. How many passwords do they have to? Anyway, that's a by the by. But it's not by the by. It's important actually. Yeah, get rid of performance tables, sample testing, and sort the primary assessment gateway out.
Okay, and then I'm going to say the last thing. So assuming that the schools minister, current school minister, is listening, and the education secretary is listening now, and the future ones are listening now, which they will be. One key thing to say, as Laura McInerney will say to you very regularly, remember, you're in your position because you were successful in the exams which you did. So you're the kind of person who is successful in exams. So your approach and your experience of taking any kind of assessment is very different from a lot of pupils. A lot of pupils find exams stressful and difficult. We know that mental health awareness and understanding and just the acceptance that actually, for mental health is quite fragile. And we know that much more so. So you need to think about the effect and the impact of assessing pupils who are not successful in assessments. Now, again, at GCSE, A-level, those pupils are 16, 18, they're growing towards being adults. But assessing an 8-year-old is a different thing. And an 8-year-old's sense of self and sense of, everything about them is still developing. And you need to be very careful, because assessment, it's fine if you're successful. And loads of people who teach and say education ministers are successful people. But remember, a lot of people are not going to be at the top end of the distribution. They're going to be lower down. And therefore, you need to be a little bit more sensitive about the way you manage these things, particularly in primary school, particularly with, these are young pupils, they're young children. So just have some awareness of the fact these are little people.
Yeah, I mean, that's a brilliant way to round that off. I mean, I wish that teachers were a big enough voting part of the voting population to actually, because you guys would win no problem on a joint ticket with that manifesto, because everything you're describing would make conditions and the accuracy of what we hope to do much, much better, so I hope that one day we exist in a world where that is the case, and where we're not spending our half terms selecting all and ticking boxes. We've all been there. I mean, it's wonderful chatting to you guys. I mean, whenever I have these conversations, I'm always aware to my depth, and I know that everyone listening will find this extremely useful. And if we can change one senior leader's mind about how they go about things in school, and that'd be absolutely fantastic. Data proofing your school goes into what we've discussed in much greater depth, and it actually has a section at the end that helps schools to put their own plan together, which I think is really, really important, so they can take the book and the message and act on it. Like I say, I bought it for 3 of my school leaders. James, you were saying to start, get it for your school leaders, get it for your governors, so that the conversations you're having are much more enlightened and working towards that utopia that we've described. Yes, all that is that. Thank you very much for joining me. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your time.